My name is Stephanie Chen, and I'm 31 years old. 3 months ago, I made the most calculated business decision of my life and completely blindsided my husband in the process. I sold my stake in our company to his rival, his biggest business competitor, and I did it without telling him. But before I tell you what happened when he found out, and more importantly, what I did with that leaked recording, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy this story, though. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love connecting with you all. This story isn't just about betrayal in a marriage. It's about a partnership that was built on a lie so fundamental that everything we constructed together was resting on a broken foundation. It's about a woman who finally stopped accepting the narrative she was being fed and started asking questions that would change everything. I'm going to take you back to where it all began, to the moment I realized the man I married wasn't who I thought he was. But I also want to say up front that this is complicated. There are no pure villains in this story, just broken people making damaging choices. I spent 7 years believing I was the problem, and I spent another 2 years figuring out the truth. By the time I did, I'd already lost more than I could ever get back. So before you judge me for what I did next, understand that I was fighting for something bigger than pride or revenge. I was fighting for my own survival. When I met Marcus Chen, I was 23 and he was 25. We met at a tech conference in San Francisco, where I was presenting my first app, a project management tool I'd built in my apartment over 6 months. Marcus approached me after my presentation. His eyes lit up when I explained my concept, and he said something I'll never forget. This is exactly what the market needs. Not 10 years from now, right now. 3 months later, we were business partners. 6 months after that, we were engaged. 2 years later, we were married with a startup that was growing faster than either of us could have anticipated. On paper, we were a perfect match. I had the vision and the technical skills. Marcus had the business acumen, the sales ability, the networking power. He could talk to anyone and make them believe in what we were building. Together, we felt unstoppable. We bootstrapped the company with a small angel investment and reinvested every dollar we made back into growth. By year 3, we had 40 employees. By year 5, we had 200. By year 7, when the acquisition offers started coming in, we were valued at over $100 million. I remember thinking we'd made it, that this was the dream, that nothing could possibly go wrong now that we'd finally achieved what we set out to do. I was spectacularly naive. The first sign something was wrong came during a routine audit. I was handling finances that quarter while Marcus was traveling for business development. The accountant flagged a series of payments that didn't align with our approved vendor list. $3 million over 18 months to a company called Vertex Holdings. I recognized the name immediately. Vertex Holdings wasn't just any company. It was owned by David Ortiz, Marcus's college roommate, and the one person in Marcus's life he'd told me he no longer spoke to. Years ago, right before I met Marcus, there'd been some kind of falling out. Marcus never gave me details, just said they'd wanted different things and drifted apart. I let it go. People grow apart from college friends all the time. But this wasn't a coincidence. I called Marcus while he was in New York for a client meeting. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I need you to explain something to me. There's a vendor in our books, Vertex Holdings. Ring any bells?" Silence. Then, "Stephanie, not now. I'm in the middle of a meeting. Don't do that. Don't minimize this. $3 million, Marcus. Where is that money going?" Another pause, longer this time. "I can explain when I get home. We need to talk about this in person." That was when I knew. If it was innocent, he would have explained immediately. The hesitation, the deflection, the demand for privacy to discuss it, I knew. He came home 2 days later. I had the bank statements spread across our dining table, highlighted and tabbed. When Marcus walked in, he saw them immediately, and his face went pale. Before I could even speak, he sat down and started talking. "Stephanie, please. Just let me explain this before you jump to conclusions. I'm listening." And he told me everything. Or at least, he told me his version of everything. Vertex Holdings wasn't a separate vendor. It was David Ortiz's investment company. And David wasn't just investing our money. He was our silent partner. Our invisible silent partner in a company I thought was entirely mine. The story went like this. Years before I met Marcus, he and David had started a different company together, a software platform for enterprise clients. They'd both poured everything into it, hundreds of thousands of hours, nights, and weekends. They were real friends, the kind who'd known each other since freshman year of college. But the company struggled. The market wasn't ready. They ran out of money in year 2. They had to shut it down. David lost everything. His savings, his equity stake, all of it gone. He blamed Marcus completely. He said Marcus had made catastrophic decisions and that tanked the company. He said Marcus had been reckless with investor money and strategic direction. And he was right about some of it. Marcus admitted it. He had made mistakes. But instead of facing those mistakes, instead of having an honest conversation about what went wrong and how to move forward, David just disappeared. He ghosted Marcus, refused his calls, wouldn't respond to emails. Years went by without any contact. Marcus moved forward. He met me. We built something new. We built something successful. He thought that chapter was closed. But according to Marcus, David never really let it go. And apparently, David had been watching our company grow, watching us succeed. And at some point, David reached out, not with forgiveness, but with leverage. David said he wouldn't publicly claim ownership of our company or file suits claiming he'd been wronged unless we paid him a percentage of our profits and made him a silent financial stakeholder. It was extortion dressed up as a business negotiation. Marcus said he'd been stuck. He said if David went public with his claims, it would destroy our valuation, kill our acquisition prospects, tangle the company in litigation for years. So Marcus had paid him. And he never told me. Not once in 7 years did he mention that our company had a secret partner pulling money out and making demands behind the scenes. I stood there in our kitchen listening to this confession and felt something crack open inside me. You lied to me. Not a white lie, Marcus. A fundamental lie. About our company, about our partnership. I trusted you completely. And you didn't trust me with the truth. I trusted you with money, with my career, with my life. And you made these massive decisions without me. He reached for my hand. I pulled away. Stephanie, I was trying to protect you. Protect me from what? From the truth? The only thing you were protecting was yourself. Because if I'd known, I would have wanted to handle it differently. I would have wanted to fight back instead of just paying and paying and paying. And now he has leverage over both of us. He has leverage over our entire company. That was when the weight of what he'd done finally seemed to hit him. But I didn't want his epiphany. I didn't want his guilt. I wanted solutions. I wanted answers to questions I couldn't even articulate yet because I was too angry to think straight. Okay, I need to pause here for a second because I want to ask you something. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely had been lying to you about something fundamental, something that changes how you see everything you built together? I want to know. Drop a comment and tell me if you've been there. And if this story is hitting close to home for you, please hit that like button. It means the world to me, and it helps this story reach people who really need to hear it. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because this is where everything changes direction. After that conversation, I couldn't look at Marcus the same way. We slept in separate rooms for a week. We didn't fight loudly. We barely spoke at all. It was the kind of silence that's worse than screaming because it means the damage is done and you're both just processing it separately. I spent those 7 days doing what I do best when my emotions become too much. I researched. I dug into every aspect of our company's finances going back to the beginning. I pulled David Ortiz's public records, his business filings, his legal history. What I found was worse than Marcus had told me. David Ortiz wasn't just a scorned business partner looking for a financial compensation. He was a serial operator. There were at least 4 other startups in his portfolio that had similar structures. Founders who'd paid him off quietly, He'd essentially turned his failure into a permanent income stream by leveraging the guilt and fear of former colleagues. He was a professional blackmailer, but he was smart enough to do it in a way that couldn't easily be prosecuted. Every agreement was framed as a legitimate investment. Every payment looked like a business transaction, but it was a protection racket dressed up in spreadsheets and legal documents. I showed Marcus what I'd found. We need to fight back, expose what he's doing, go to our investors, get lawyers involved. But Marcus was terrified. David had warned him that any move to cut him out would result in recordings being released. Conversations about the extortion that would destroy Marcus's reputation and the company. At that point, I believed Marcus had finally told me the truth. I didn't realize he'd only told me half of it. The moment of clarity came 3 weeks later during a closed-door investor meeting. I was presenting growth metrics when one of our newest investors, Thomas Garrett, pulled me aside afterward. He said, "Stephanie, I need to talk to you about something sensitive." Off the record, he told me that David Ortiz had approached him before the funding round, that David had claimed he was a partner in the company, and that Thomas should be aware of this fact before investing. David had even offered to provide documentation. Thomas said he declined and wanted to give Marcus and me a chance to explain before he made any decisions about his position. But the fact that it had happened meant the secret was unraveling. It meant David was becoming bolder. It meant the extortion was escalating. And it meant Marcus had lied to me again. Not by omission this time, but by active deception. He'd led me to believe the situation was contained, that it was a manageable problem we could solve together, when actually, David was already beginning to weaponize his stake in public investor conversations. I confronted Marcus that night, and he finally broke. He told me everything. Not just about David, but about a second person who had similar leverage over him. Someone from his past that I didn't even know about. There were dozens of thousands of dollars going to accounts I couldn't trace. There were agreements I'd never seen. There were business decisions being made without my input, supposedly for the sake of maintaining peace with people he'd wronged years ago. And I realized in that moment that the company I thought I'd built, the partnership I thought was egalitarian and based on mutual trust, was actually something entirely different. I was a figurehead. I was the technical talent, sure, but Marcus controlled everything else. And worse, I was complicit in it because I trusted him to manage the business side while I focused on the product. I'd given him power without accountability, and he'd leveraged that power in ways that had created financial obligations and legal vulnerabilities that could destroy everything we'd built. That night, I made a decision that I didn't tell Marcus about. I'd been approached months earlier by David Ortiz's main competitor in the venture space, a man named James Wu. James ran a larger investment fund, and he'd been interested in acquiring our company before we'd even known about David's involvement. At the time, I dismissed the interest as normal business development, but now I understood something crucial. James Wu knew about David. James Wu probably knew more about David's operation than anyone outside of David's inner circle. And James Wu would be very interested in acquiring a company that came with the baggage of David Ortiz attached to it, because that acquisition would give James leverage over David himself. I was beginning to see how the game actually worked, and I was tired of being the piece on the board instead of the one playing the game. I reached out to James Wu. I said I was interested in acquisition options, but needed confidentiality. We met at a coffee shop in Palo Alto. I told him everything about David Ortiz, the extortion, the secret financial agreements, Marcus's role, the recordings. Then I asked directly, "What would you pay for my stake if David Ortiz came with it?" James said, "You're not asking for an acquisition. You're asking if I'd buy you out." I nodded. I want out. I want David Ortiz to become someone else's problem. James leaned back. "I'll buy your stake for $30 million within 48 hours. But I need you to facilitate an introduction with David and tell Marcus I approached you first. This needs to look natural, not like a conspiracy." I agreed. Then I added one condition. Document everything. recordings of every conversation, paper trails. When this falls apart, I need proof I didn't orchestrate the criminality. I just want it out. James nodded. We can do that. You'll be protected. I wanted to believe him. The next morning, I told Marcus that James Wu had reached out with a new acquisition offer, and this time he wanted to meet with both of us. I said it might be a real opportunity, that we should take the meeting seriously. Marcus was excited. He thought an acquisition was exactly what we needed. A clean exit, a massive payout, a way to get everyone off his back, because once the company was sold, all the agreements with David would transfer to the new owner. Of course, Marcus didn't realize that James Wu wanted the company specifically because of David Ortiz, not despite him. And Marcus didn't know that I'd already agreed to sell my stake to James, that James already had my shares locked up in a side agreement. The three of us met in James Wu's office downtown. Marcus was charming, enthusiastic, pitching the vision for the company and where it could go. James listened intently, asked good questions, and then made his offer. James said he wanted to acquire majority control of the company. He was offering $200 million. That was the number. $200 million. Marcus's face went pale. He looked at me to see if I was as shocked as he was. The offer was double what we'd been valued at. It made no sense unless James knew something we didn't, which he did. James knew that the company came with leverage over David Ortiz, and David Ortiz had leverage over dozens of other entrepreneurs. This wasn't just an acquisition. It was an investment in future power plays and negotiations. It was James buying into a network of people he could pressure and influence. But here's where it got complicated. James made the offer conditional. He said he'd only move forward with the acquisition if both Marcus and I agreed to stay on as executives for at least 2 years post-acquisition. That meant Marcus would still be there. That meant I couldn't just take my $30 million and disappear. I'd still be bound to this company. I'd still be working alongside my husband. I'd still be exposed to whatever fallout came from James Wu's handling of David Ortiz. When James said the condition out loud, I understood that this was part of his strategy. He wanted Marcus to feel secure. He wanted both of us to believe we were part of his grand plan. He was buying cooperation, not just equity. Marcus was thrilled. He said yes immediately. He looked at me, waiting for me to confirm. I waited 3 seconds. 3 long seconds that felt like hours. And then I said yes. But inside, I'd already activated Plan B, because I had something James Wu didn't know I had. I had David Ortiz's voice. All of it. Every conversation between David and Marcus. David had been recording for insurance. And somehow, months earlier, Marcus had accidentally sent me those recordings instead of destroying them like he was supposed to. They were still in an encrypted file on my computer, and I still had the passwords. Over the next 3 weeks, the acquisition process moved forward rapidly. Lawyers were engaged. Due diligence was conducted extensively. James Wu had his teams comb through everything. Our financials, our technology, our contracts, our communication records. They were thorough. And during that process, David Ortiz found out about the acquisition. I'm not sure who told him. Maybe Marcus felt guilty and warned him. Maybe it was someone in legal who had a conscience. Maybe David just heard through the venture capital gossip network that always knows everything before it's official. But David reached out to Marcus in a state of panic. He called him, demanding answers. He said, "What is this I'm hearing about James Wu acquiring the company?" This wasn't the plan. We had a plan. We had an agreement. Marcus told me later that he tried to calm David down, tried to tell him that the acquisition was actually good for both of them because James Wu was supposedly willing to honor the existing agreements and the financial arrangements, but David didn't buy it. David was skeptical and suspicious. David said he wanted to talk to me directly. He wanted to make sure I wasn't trying to cut him out of everything. And that was when I made my first major strategic move. I called David Ortiz. I said, "I'd like to meet with you, just you and me, no Marcus." He was suspicious, of course, but I appealed to his vanity. I said, "I've spent months learning about your business model, your approach to investment, your philosophy on how business relationships should be structured. I think I've been unfair to you, in my mind. I'd like to understand your perspective directly. It was a lie, obviously. I had zero respect for his perspective. But I needed him to believe that I was potentially an ally, that I was willing to see things from his angle. We met at a restaurant in the financial district. David came alone, which was exactly what I needed. I had a phone in my pocket, recording everything. And I spent 2 hours asking him detailed questions about his arrangement with Marcus, about how it started, about his leverage, about his recordings, about his plans for the future. And David, he was proud of what he'd built. He actually believed his extortion operation was a legitimate investment strategy. He talked about his other deals. He named names. He explained his philosophy on how to maintain leverage over entrepreneurs who'd wronged him. By the end of the conversation, I had a recording that was absolutely incriminating. Not just for David, but potentially for Marcus too, because David made references to Marcus's knowledge of all of it. David also made statements that could be classified as extortion under state law. But here's what David didn't know. I wasn't recording for legal purposes. I wasn't recording to build a case against him or to hand over to authorities. I was recording because I needed leverage of my own. I needed insurance. I needed something that would protect me in whatever came next. 3 days before the acquisition was supposed to close, I made a critical decision. I contacted David Ortiz directly and told him I had a proposition for him. I said that if the acquisition went through as planned, his deal with Marcus would become my problem, and I wasn't interested in maintaining it. But, I said, I also wasn't interested in seeing this particular arrangement become public knowledge. So here's what I'm offering. I'm going to send you a recording of our conversation. In that recording, you'll hear your own voice, making statements that could be used against you in ways you haven't considered. Statements about extortion, about leverage, about your entire operation. I'm going to give you that recording as a gift, freely. No strings attached, no conditions. Because I want you to understand that I have options. I have leverage too. And I want you to also understand that what happens next is entirely up to how cooperative you are with me. David listened. He was completely quiet for a long time, processing what I was telling him. Then he asked, "What do you want from me?" And that's when I told him my actual plan for how we could all survive this. I wanted him to come clean to James Wu, not to authorities, not to law enforcement, but to James Wu directly. Because James Wu already knows about you. James already has plans for how to use your situation to his advantage. But if you voluntarily give him the recordings, if you explain the arrangement, if you present it to him before he finds out some other way, then maybe you can negotiate terms that don't completely destroy you. David asked me why I would help him, why I would give him this recording, why I would warn him. And I told him the truth. I'm not helping you. I'm helping myself. By giving you this information, I'm removing a variable from an equation that's about to get very complicated. I'm making sure that when everything falls apart, you're not holding a recording of me trying to orchestrate this. You're holding evidence that I actually tried to be reasonable with you. You're holding proof that I gave you a chance to handle this with some dignity. If you don't take that chance, then what happens next is entirely on you. I sent him the recording that same night via encrypted email, and then I waited, holding my breath. The acquisition closed 48 hours later, exactly on schedule. My $30 million hit my account. I was officially bought out. I was free. Or at least, I thought I was finally free. But I'd learned by then that freedom in this kind of situation is just the space between one problem ending and another one beginning. It's just a pause in the chaos. And I had absolutely no idea what was about to happen when Marcus realized that I hadn't actually left the company, that I was still there as an executive. And more importantly, when he found out exactly what I'd done with David Ortiz's voice, what I'd orchestrated. The first thing Marcus noticed was that I didn't leave. The lawyers sent over the executive appointment letters on a Tuesday morning. Senior Vice President of Product Operations. That was my new title, my new salary, my new golden handcuffs. And I read those papers 3 times before I signed them because I needed to be absolutely certain that I understood every clause, every condition, every escape hatch. I wanted to make sure that staying at this company was something I could control, that if things went sideways, I had a way out that didn't depend on anyone else's cooperation. Marcus called me into his office in the afternoon, closed the door. I could see him processing it, the fact that I hadn't left, that I was signing on for the next 2 years under James Wu's leadership. He said, "Stephanie, you're still here. I mean, I knew intellectually that you'd agree to stay, but I thought maybe you'd change your mind once the money hit, once the reality of it sank in. You'd reconsider." That's what he said, reconsider. Like staying at the company I'd built, the product I'd designed from nothing, was some kind of whimsical decision I'd made in a moment of emotion and could easily reverse if I really wanted to. Like I'd signed a 2-year contract without thinking through the implications. "No," I said. "I've reconsidered. I'm staying. The contract is solid." James wanted both of us, and I agreed. He looked relieved. Actually relieved. Like he'd been terrified I'd abandon him the moment the money hit, that I'd take my $30 million and disappear into some new venture and leave him alone to deal with the fallout from his lies. Now everything was going to be fine. The acquisition had closed successfully. James Wu owned controlling interest. We were safe. The extortion situation was someone else's problem now. That's what he thought anyway. What he didn't know was that James Wu had already been contacted by David Ortiz. That David had voluntarily come to James's office with his own legal team and basically handed over his entire leverage operation as a gift wrapped in conversation. David had made a strategic calculation. He understood that trying to maintain his independence with a predator like James Wu circling was only going to end one way. So David came clean. He explained the extortion arrangement with Marcus in detail. He provided the recordings I'd sent him. He admitted everything. He even brought copies of his agreements with the other founders, the other deals, the whole ecosystem of leverage he'd built over years. And James Wu, who I'd already briefed on the situation before the acquisition closed, accepted it all with the kind of smile a predator has when prey walks directly into its jaws. David thought he was being smart, coming forward, being transparent, showing James that he was willing to cooperate. And technically, he was right. But what David didn't understand is that James Wu doesn't want partners. James Wu doesn't want cooperative equals. James Wu wants controlled assets. And by handing over his entire operation, David had just transformed himself from an independent threat into a completely manageable tool. James could now use David's leverage to control not just Marcus, but dozens of other founders. David had inadvertently created a framework where James could own an entire network. And David, thinking he was protecting himself, had actually walked straight into a cage. What? Marcus didn't find out any of this for almost 2 weeks. I watched him come to work every morning, completely unaware that everything was unraveling beneath his feet. James Wu's team was moving through the company like water, efficient and purposeful. They were integrating our systems, absorbing our culture, learning our processes, and quietly building the infrastructure to leverage David Ortiz's entire operation into a much larger network of control and influence. They were absolute geniuses at it. They didn't announce anything. They didn't confront Marcus immediately. They didn't make any big moves that would spook him. They just started, very quietly, calling in the obligations, reaching out to David's other business partners, making contact with the other founders who had similar secret arrangements. James was consolidating power by systematically collecting all the leverage that David had spent years accumulating. And Marcus was just sitting in his office, probably feeling pretty good about himself for navigating an exit that he thought had solved all his problems. An exit that was supposed to be clean, a fresh start, a new chapter. I almost felt guilty watching it happen. Almost. But guilt is a luxury I couldn't afford. Guilt is something you have when you have the privilege of choice. And I'd run out of choices the moment Marcus decided to lie to me and keep lying to me and never give me a chance to make informed decisions about my own future. I was protecting myself because no one else was going to. Everything I'd done, every calculation, every strategic move had been about making sure that when this building collapsed, when the whole structure imploded under the weight of the lies and the leverage and the extortion, I wasn't underneath it. I was watching it from outside. I was safe. I had my money, I had my contract, I had my future secure. And that was all that mattered anymore. The confrontation came during a closed-door meeting with James Wu, Marcus, and me. James had requested it on a Wednesday morning. He said it was just a routine check-in, wanted to discuss integration strategy and long-term vision. We all sat around his conference table on the 42nd floor with a view of the entire city spread below us like a game board. San Francisco gleaming in the afternoon sun. All those buildings full of people working on their startups, their dreams, their plans, completely unaware of how easily it could all be taken apart by someone with enough leverage and ambition. James pulled out a laptop, set it on the conference table. He turned it so that we could all see the screen. He said, "Before we talk about the future, I think we need to address some lingering complications from the past." And then he hit play. David Ortiz's voice came through the speakers, tinny, compressed, but unmistakably real. David was describing the extortion arrangement in detail, explaining how it started, how he'd leveraged Marcus's guilt about the failed company, how he'd created an insurance policy through recordings, how he'd threatened Marcus with exposure if the payments stopped. He was describing the leverage. He was describing the threats. He was describing the recordings he'd secretly made of Marcus admitting to all of it. Marcus's face went white, not pale, not flushed, just completely drained of color. His hands gripped the edge of the conference table so hard his knuckles turned white, and I could see the veins in his forearms rise up like cords. He said my name like a question. Stephanie. I didn't even look at him. I just kept my eyes on James. James continued playing. More recordings. David explaining his philosophy. David describing his other deals, the other founders, the other leverage points, the full scope of what David had been building over the years, the scope of what Marcus had been enabling through his silence and his payments. What I apparently had facilitated by being complicit in that silence, by letting it happen, by not fighting back harder, by accepting his explanations when I should have walked away, when I should have protected myself years ago instead of waiting until everything was falling apart. Marcus turned to me, and I saw it in his eyes. The moment he realized, the moment he understood that I'd known about this, that I'd done something, that I hadn't just passively accepted the situation and waited for him to fix it, that I'd taken action without telling him. He said my name like a question. Stephanie. Like he was asking me to explain, to deny it, to tell him it wasn't what it looked like. I didn't say anything. I just let him sit with it, let him process it. James used the silence to his advantage. He explained that David had approached him with all this information, that they'd had a productive conversation about how to restructure the agreements, how to handle the obligations in a way that was mutually beneficial for everyone involved. He said that David understood that in exchange for transparency and cooperation, James would honor the existing financial arrangements but fold them into a larger framework, a much larger framework, a framework where David was no longer operating as an independent actor running his own operation, but as a controlled asset in James's larger network of influence and leverage. What James was describing, in very polite corporate terms, was owning David Ortiz completely, owning his entire operation, owning every relationship, owning every piece of leverage David had spent years accumulating, and by extension, owning leverage over every founder David had ever pressured, every person David had extorted, every deal David had made. They'd all just become James Wu's to leverage. The meeting lasted another hour. James outlined his vision for what the next 5 years would look like. Marcus tried to ask questions, tried to understand what his role would be in all of this, what his future looked like, whether he was safe. James was patient with him. He explained that Marcus was free to leave if he wanted. The 2-year agreement was with me, not with Marcus. The company needed me more than it needed him. But James would prefer that Marcus stay. And if he stayed, James would make sure that the whole extortion situation was handled quietly, discreetly. No legal consequences for anyone involved, no criminal charges, no public scandals. Everyone walks away with their dignity mostly intact, just under James Wu's control now, just answering to a different master. When we left that conference room, Marcus didn't speak to me for 3 full hours. We were still in the building. We passed each other in the hallway twice on the way back to our offices. We both pretended the other didn't exist. Both of us walking with our eyes forward, our postures rigid, our faces blank. Finally, at the end of the day, he came to my office. He closed the door quietly behind him. He sat down without being invited. He said, "What did you do, Stephanie? What exactly did you do?" I met his gaze steadily. I met his eyes and didn't look away. I protected myself. "That's what I did. I listened to your confession about David. I watched you panic about his leverage over us. I realized that nothing was going to change if I just went along with it, if I just waited for you to figure it out. I realized that the only way to survive this situation was to become someone with leverage too. So I recorded David. I made a recording of our conversation at the restaurant where he explained everything. I sent him the recording. And I warned him that James Wu was coming. I gave him a chance to control the narrative instead of having it controlled for him." Marcus's voice was quiet when he spoke. "You sold my company to a man who's now trying to own me, to own everything I built." I said, "No. I sold my stake to a man who offered me $30 million. I stayed at the company because that was a condition of the deal. That was part of my negotiation. I'm protected. I have a contract, I have compensation, I have an exit strategy. What you have, Marcus, is a problem that started long before I decided to solve it, long before I sold my shares. David was already destroying everything. You just couldn't see it because you were too busy being afraid of him to do anything about it. You were too busy protecting him by keeping his secret. And now someone is handling it. Not perfectly, not ethically, but someone is handling it. You can either accept that and find a way to work with James, or you can blow it all up trying to be noble, and then you'll have legal consequences on top of everything else." Marcus sat down in my office chair like he'd forgotten how to stand. Like his legs had given out, he looked broken. Like the man I'd married had finally shattered completely. And maybe he had. Maybe what I'd done was the final weight that broke him. The thing that made him realize he couldn't fix this. Couldn't control it. Couldn't talk his way out of it the way he'd talked his way through everything else. But I couldn't afford to care about that anymore. I couldn't afford to carry his guilt alongside my own. Okay, I need to pause here for a second because I want to ask you something really important. When you're in a situation where someone you love has lied to you, lied systematically and repeatedly, and created problems that threaten to destroy everything you've both built together, do you feel obligated to protect them from the consequences, or do you prioritize protecting yourself? Because that's the question I asked myself every single day leading up to the acquisition. Every single day, I'd lie awake at night thinking about it. And I know there's no easy answer. I know that some of you watching are probably thinking I'm a villain, that I should have confronted Marcus more directly, given him one final chance to fix it himself, trusted in his ability to actually do the right thing. But I'd already given him that chance. Not once, not twice, repeatedly, over and over again. Every time he lied, I gave him another chance to come clean. Every time he asked me to keep quiet about another problem, I kept quiet. Every time he chose his comfort over my security, I accepted it and moved on. And it kept happening. The lies kept growing. The problems kept multiplying. New obligations appeared. New recordings surfaced. New people appeared demanding money or leverage or control. At some point, protecting someone becomes sacrificing yourself. It becomes martyrdom. And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. I wasn't willing to be the good wife who stood by her husband while he destroyed everything. So if you're in a situation like that right now, if you're watching someone you love destroy everything and taking you down with them in the process, I want you to know something. Your survival matters too. Your security matters. Your future matters. And sometimes protecting that means doing things that feel ruthless, uncomfortable things that will make you look like the villain in someone else's story, things you'll have to live with. Drop a comment and tell me if you've ever been in that position. Have you ever had to choose yourself over someone you loved? Tell me. And if this story is resonating with you, please hit that like button. It means the world to me, and it helps this story reach other people who are struggling with similar situations. The following weeks were absolute chaos. Everything fell apart in ways I didn't even anticipate. Marcus tried to negotiate with James. He hired expensive lawyers who specialized in tech deals. He attempted to restructure his own arrangements to protect himself from the liability he knew was coming. But he was negotiating from a position of complete weakness. And James Wu knew it. James could see it. Marcus was trapped. The acquisition agreements were ironclad. The 2-year employment contract was binding. The fact that blowing up the situation would expose him to legal liability alongside David Ortiz. Criminal liability potentially. Marcus had very few good options left. The one he eventually chose was resignation. He told James and me that he couldn't work in the company anymore, that he couldn't look at me, that he couldn't function in an environment where everything was a lie, where trust had been completely shattered. James accepted the resignation without any fight whatsoever. In fact, James was probably relieved. Marcus was a liability at that point. He knew too much about what David had been doing. He'd been complicit in the extortion. He could become a witness. Having him suddenly step away was actually helpful to James's long-term plans. It cleaned up a loose end. Marcus cleaned out his desk on a Friday afternoon. I was in a meeting with the product team, presenting roadmap updates, and when I got back to my office, he'd left a handwritten letter on my desk, sitting there on top of my keyboard. I didn't open it for 3 days. I just looked at it, stared at it, tried to prepare myself for what it would say. When I finally did open it, it was short, brief, handwritten in blue ink on expensive paper. Stephanie, I'm sorry for every lie. I'm sorry I made decisions that put you in a position where you felt you had to betray me to survive. I'm sorry I wasn't the partner you deserved. I'm sorry I was weak when you needed me to be strong. I hope James Wu treats you better than I did. I hope you find what you're actually looking for in all of this. I don't expect your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I understand why you did what you did. And if I'm being completely honest, if I were you, I probably would have done the same thing. Take care of yourself, Stephanie. That's all I'll ask of you now. Marcus Chen. I kept the letter for exactly 1 month. I read it several times. Each time, it made me sadder and angrier at the same time. Then I burned it, watched it turn to ash in the fireplace of my apartment, and I tried not to think about the fact that Marcus had left the country. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to Southeast Asia, that he was teaching at an international school somewhere in Thailand or Vietnam, that he was trying to build a completely separate life, as far away from the tech industry and the venture capital world and everyone who knew about what he'd done as possible. Part of me understood that impulse, the desire to disappear, the need to start over, but another part of me knew that running away didn't actually solve anything. It just postponed the reckoning. It just delayed the moment when you'd have to face what you'd done and who you'd become. And for Marcus, that reckoning was going to follow him whether he was building apps in San Francisco or teaching English in Bangkok or working anywhere else on the planet. As for me, I stayed at the company. I worked with James Wu for the next 2 years, exactly as the contract specified. No more, no less. It was strange working for him. He was brilliant and ruthless in equal measure, charismatic in meetings, merciless in negotiations. He'd taken David Ortiz's extortion operation and converted it into something much larger and more organized, a network of obligations and leverage that stretched across dozens of startups and hundreds of entrepreneurs. He'd taken what was essentially a criminal enterprise and made it legitimate through sheer force of will and brilliant legal infrastructure. Through lawyers and contracts and structures that looked completely legitimate on paper. I watched him do it day after day. I learned from it. I observed the mechanisms of power in ways I never would have otherwise understood. And I completed my 2-year contract exactly on time, delivered my resignation on the exact date it was supposed to end. When it ended, I walked away with stock options that had tripled in value, a network of connections that spanned the entire venture capital world, and a complete understanding of how power actually works in Silicon Valley. The answer is simple. It's not about the best ideas. It's not about hard work. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about having leverage over the right people at the right time. That's it. That's the whole equation. The last thing I did before I left the company was call David Ortiz. I wanted to know if he'd actually learned anything from this experience. If getting caught, exposed, and brought under James Wu's control had changed him at all. Or if he was just continuing to operate under a different master now. David was surprisingly polite on the phone when I called. He thanked me for giving him a chance to come clean to James instead of having the whole situation blown up publicly. He said that the arrangement with James was actually better than his arrangement with Marcus had ever been. More stable, better compensation, less risk, less need for him to constantly threaten and negotiate. He was thriving. That told me everything I needed to know about David Ortiz. He hadn't learned anything. He'd just found a more powerful partner to victimize others with, a more organized system. People like that don't change. They just find new systems to exploit, new masters to serve. And the fact that I'd inadvertently helped him find an even better system, well, that's the kind of unintended consequence you have to live with when you start playing games with people's lives. So here's what I want to say to you if you're watching this and you're in a relationship where you've discovered that the person you trust has been lying to you about fundamental things. Don't assume there's a good explanation coming that will make it all make sense. Don't wait for them to have some grand epiphany where they realize what they've done and how much they've hurt you. Don't sacrifice your own security on the hope that they'll eventually do the right thing. Because they probably won't. Not because they're bad people necessarily, but because people are motivated by self-preservation first and everything else second. That's just how people work. Marcus loved me, I think. Or at least he loved the version of me that was easy. But he loved himself more. He was terrified of David Ortiz more than he cared about my feelings, more than he cared about my trust. And that's not unusual. That's not malicious. That's just human. But it also means that when you're in a partnership with someone like that, when you're building something with someone who will sacrifice you to protect themselves, your only real option is to ensure you're not dependent on them for your survival. I sold my stake. I negotiated my own deal with James Wu. I protected myself. And yes, I betrayed my husband in the process. But he'd already betrayed me first, multiple times. I just did it better. I did it in a way that nobody could recover from or rewrite. I did it in a way that put me in control of the outcome instead of leaving myself at the mercy of whatever he was going to do next, whatever lie he was going to tell next. And maybe that makes me ruthless. Maybe that makes me the villain in his story. Maybe people see me and think I'm cold or calculated or selfish, but it makes me a survivor in mine. And that's what I needed to be. That's what mattered.